Hello, my name is Ed Wasson, and I'm a master's degree student at American Military University's International Relations and Global Security program. I'm going to be talking about the Chechnya Simulation Exercise. First of all, I want to say thank you to Professor Ahmed and the AMU staff for the course material, and thank you to the class for the participation in the simulation. I assumed the role of Shamsel Sarayalev, the press secretary to Chechen President Ahmad Kadyrov. Speaking to the purpose of the Chechnya conflict simulation and the importance of the topic, the simulation offered the class opportunities to practice roles and discuss the complex processes of prolonged asymmetric conflict in a war zone. The class members took on real-world people's roles: the politicians, the insurgents, the international mediators, and civil society representatives. Participants were faced with many of the challenges of resolving a long-standing conflict. The simulation was also a look back into the history of the conflict, with the added benefits of insight into the mechanics of power, identity, and diplomatic efforts. The First and Second Chechen Wars are good case studies because they're strikingly similar to many other regional conflicts involving dominant nation states and smaller and weaker belligerents. Many conflicts like this are about self-determination versus state sovereignty, cultural survival, and the destructive potential of extremism. When we look at Chechnya, we recognize the same universal patterns of conflict seen in Israel-Palestine, the Kurdish question, and the current Russia-Ukraine war. So Chechnya is not isolated. It's not just a conflict within Russia. It's one of many broader issues that affect our increasingly interconnected world, from geopolitics to international human rights. Analysis of this conflict helps us develop strategies for conflict resolution and build empathy for the lived realities of war's casualties, the ordinary civilians. Through the course in general, we learn to apply theories of international relations to Chechnya and related conflicts. Understanding the conflicts, like Chechnya's, requires analysis through multiple international relations or IR perspectives or theories, demonstrating their usefulness, but in my view, mostly their limitations. A brief overview of the main theories and subtheories are as follows. There's realism and neoclassical realism, and these theories see the Chechnya conflict as a classical example of power politics. Russia, as a nation-state, prioritizes its sovereignty and territorial integrity, leveraging its military power and central authority to crush separatist groups and their aspirations. And in the international regime, Russia knows that as a nation-state, it has more clout. One can also use this theory to review Turkey, Iraq, and Iran's suppression of the Kurds, or China's stance on Taiwan or the Uyghurs. Another IR theory is constructivism. Chechnya's conflict has some aspects of identity and culture, and from the constructivist lens, the Chechens' Islamic and national identity is a key driver, similar to the struggles of Armenians, Yazidis, Masalit, or the Tigray people, who all fight for cultural survival in almost impossibly hostile environments. Constructivism helps explain how narratives of resistance versus oppression are constructed and maintained. I think this can be applied to review of Russia as well if we look at Russian continuity theory. For the purposes of conflict analysis and resolution, what will Russia do next in Ukraine? Probably the same things they did in Chechnya and Georgia. They're not going to capitulate or stop or budge. And the international community, likewise, in Ukraine, will do the same thing they did in Chechnya and Georgia, which is nothing much. While some, like Tyler J. Pack, assert that Russian continuity theory applies mostly or almost exclusively to Russia, it also applies heavily to the United States of America. There was much continuity in foreign policy from Bush to Obama, and maybe not quite as much with Trump, and then back to Biden. Obama promised change and that the U.S. would be above board, upright, or forthright, more transparent and less secretive, and lead by example regarding rule of law. And then came the unprecedented assassination strike in Yemen on American citizen Anwar al-Awlaki. And the world will almost certainly never see the evidence that the U.S. says it has that al-Awlaki was such a threat he had to be assassinated at any cost. And the eliminating of al-Awlaki does not necessarily stop the ambitions or goals or efforts of future would-be shoe or underwear bombers. Another international relations theory is liberalism. This is the last three of the main that I'm going to talk about. And institutions like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, played pivotal roles in peace, albeit short-lived, of the Khasavyurt Accords. Liberalism would focus on how diplomacy and international institutions can mediate or facilitate dialogue. However, it also highlights their limitations when powerful states like Russia undermine such efforts, knowing that the international system has weak mechanisms. Keep in mind that it's only recently been called the G7. Prior to that, Russia was part of the G8 prior to their 2014 invasion of Crimea. Then there's a couple of international relations subtheories like alternative and neo-Marxism. This view critiques economic exploitation and systemic inequality. In Chechnya, Russia's control of natural resources like oil pipelines would be key. Similarly, conflicts in Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, reflect how wealth extraction fuels instability. Neo-Marxists also like to talk a lot about developing country and the debt traps and the global south from the perspective of multinational corporations, or MNCs, or imperialist or neo-colonialist exploitation. Many of these themselves are limousine liberals or neo-Marxist who conceal the fact that they are actually part of the transnational or corporate elite. Then there's feminism. Feminist IR critiques highlight how war disproportionately affects or impacts women and children or minorities, often relegating them to the sidelines of peace processes. In conflicts like Darfur and Chechnya, gendered violence and the underrepresentation of women in negotiations worsens the cycles of suffering. These neo-Marxist and feminist views did not work out well in Afghanistan due to misunderstanding of the predominant culture and the cultural norms and ideations there. One American female soldier in a human terrain team, or HTT, got burned to death after an Afghan man doused her with gas and set her on fire after she spoke to him. Almost immediately after the U.S.-led coalition fully withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years of prolonged belligerent military occupation that they eventually said was nation building, the country fell back to Taliban rule, and women no longer were voting or holding office, but getting stoned to death. There's critical factors for successful conflict resolution, and the main one, I feel, was the role of ripeness. For peace to take hold, parties must reach a point of ripeness. This is a moment when they perceive continued conflict as more costly than negotiation. This concept, noted by theorists like William Zartman, could be seen in the short successes of the Khasavyurt Accords. Unfortunately, ripeness is fragile. Without addressing underlying grievances like extremism, lack of economic opportunity, and cultural suppression, ripeness dissipates, and conflict reignites and reigns anew. In my in-role opinion as Shamsil Saralayev in Chechnya, fostering ripeness required 1. A unified leadership among Chechens, rejecting extremism and seeking a coherent vision for peace. This is paramount for both Chechens, Palestinians, and others. They have to get a foothold in the international community, and then conflicts are no longer non-international armed conflicts, or NIACs, but international armed conflicts, or IACs, where the international system has much more power in the Geneva Convention, Law of Armed Conflict, or LOAC, and other rules and articles of the International Humanitarian Law, or IHL. Two, I also felt like we needed to build confidence and national pride among the Chechens and attempt ceasefires, push for economic investments, and foster cultural preservation initiatives. Three, as Shamsel Saralayev, I felt we might possibly benefit from international mediation that respects Russian sovereignty while advocating for Chechen autonomy. But in reality, I might have said that tongue-in-cheek because the reality is that I believe unless regions like Chechnya, Kurdistan, Palestine, and others are actual nation states in the international regime is almost useless. The lessons from Chechnya are universal. In conflicts like Israel, Palestine, or Ukraine, ripeness often stems from mutual exhaustion, but it also requires skillful diplomacy for sustainable peace. This is point 4 of the Chechnyan Simulation video, Lessons Learned from the Chechnyan Simulation. The simulation illustrated the inextractability of conflicts rooted in identity and power asymmetry. Some key takeaways that I, as Shamsel Saralayev, pointed out during the forum discussions within the simulation include 1. Fragmentation hinders resolution. I point out again, Chechens needed to unify. Chechnya's fractured leadership resembled real-world divisions, such as you see in Palestine with Hamas and Fatah, or PLO, where rival factions prioritize their own agendas. This reflects the broader lessons of other conflicts like South Sudan, Iraq, again Palestine, Yemen, and even Libya, where lack of unity undermines peace and the factions' efforts. This is often similar to the Islamic fitna or sectarianism between Shia and Sunni sects, where there are often short-lived or regionally contained pan-Islamic efforts. 2. Extremism must be addressed. As Saralayev, I mentioned that the presence of foreign fighters and extremist ideologies complicates negotiations and the scenario in general. Programs to rehabilitate militants offer alternatives to insurgency, such as education, jobs, and economic opportunities. These are all essential. Number 3, the role of external actors. While international mediators can be useful, their success depends on trust and respect from the conflicting parties. In the simulation, Russian skepticism of external actors and their motives limited potential successful diplomacy, and this reflected in real-life dynamics. Number 4, cultural and economic investments are critical. Chechnya's future depends on rebuilding infrastructure, fostering economic growth, and promoting national pride. Such measures are universally applicable, whether in Tigray, Darfur, or post-conflict Vietnam. Number 5, sustained effort is necessary. Peace is a very long-term process. Temporary agreements like the Khasavyurt Accords collapse without ongoing commitment to reconciliation and reform. Keep in mind, there may also be agitators who simply do not want peace as well. The simulation points out the patience required for genuine conflict resolution.